Hi, I'm Felix. I'm from Dartmouth College. As far as the actual slide deck, once it loads, this is mostly a story. So it's just going to be DALL-E generated pictures with prompts that generated that kind of illustrates the points I'm making. But you know, it's not like it's not going to go too far. So just out of interest, while this loads, who here has comprehensive network automation at their fingertips already? Or is it maybe for customers? Like no one? Genuinely no one?
We did very
Okay. The mic is working? Test. 1, 2, 3. Test. More testing. Okay, now here we go. All right, let's go back from the top. So this will eventually load. It is a large file. The slides don't really matter as such. This is more of a story. So I had DALL-E generate some images that kind of match the stuff I'm talking about with the prompt next to it. You can mostly ignore those, so if you don't get there, you don't get there. As a quick question, who here has comprehensive network automation at their fingertips already, or is enabling it for customers? That's way fewer hands than I expected, which is good. That means I'm not just talking for the camera. So this talk is titled, as you can maybe read in the small font there, Layer 8 for Automation in Brownfield. So mostly what I'm going to talk about is really 3 sections. How do you convince your boss, your manager, your staff, or your peers that you should be doing this network automation thing? I'm not going to focus on tools or how to do it. It's literally about how do you even get people to buy into you doing this as a project. After that, we're going to talk about team composition. Like what kind of teams do you need to enable this sort of thing? And then eventually some kind of lessons learned. At this point, I'm just going to assume I don't get slides. So one of the first things to kind of quickly differentiate, right, is networks come either as profit centers or cost centers. Right? If you're a profit center, you contribute to the bottom line of your company. If that is you, then this talk mostly isn't for you, because convincing people that a profit center should be doing a specific thing comes down to showing that it improves the bottom line, right? And if you can show that it improves the bottom line, if you cannot show that, then you are going to be called an idiot for even suggesting it, because why would you enable the revenue? And if you can show that it does improve the bottom line, you'll be called an idiot for not having suggested it yesterday because you left money on the table. Right? So there's all sorts of arguments you can make around that, but it's a completely different problem to have. If you are not a profit center, you are a cost center. And my argument very much is that if you are a cost center, you never want to argue about anything from the perspective of money, because you're going to lose that fight. It actually is pretty difficult. I used to work in a profit center network corporation, and they have financial analysts and actuaries and whatnot that can actually, tell you how much a network is worth and how much it should cost. But in a company that doesn't do that, when you say we can do this thing and it's going to save us resources, what people hear is I need fewer FTEs. And you don't need fewer FTEs, you already don't have enough to start with. So what you want to do is instead argue from the point of business outcomes, right? And what this comes down to, and I'm going to go fairly generic first, this is true not just for networks, people love nothing more than to complain. This is generally true for all of us, right? I bet you if you went out there while we were socializing before these talks, right, half of the conversations were about what's currently wrong with your day, or with the job, or whatever. And this is completely normal human behavior, right? So try this, listen to somebody, wait for something where wait for a point in time where they're complaining about something, echo that back at them and ask them about it, and watch their eyes light up, right? So this is your hook. You want to figure out what kind of problems people are having in your specific organization, and you then want to figure out how can I use network automation to solve that problem. In no way am I saying go and lie or exaggerate or make something up. This effectively just comes down, and in fact really that would be an extraordinarily stupid thing to do, right? Because if somebody needs help and you promise them help and then don't come through, like they're not just going to be mad, they're going to be disappointed, right? Like your dad who got the car for the weekend, you crashed it, sort of thing. You definitely don't want to do that. So for networks, mostly this comes down, in my experience, having talked to a bunch of people, to 3 or 4 things. Reliability, speed of execution, reporting, and maybe self-service. I think a lot of us actually really overestimate how much users want self-service. What users want to do is call somebody, complain about a thing, and have it fixed. They don't want to talk to a robot themselves. So for reliability, this is not just uptime of devices, right? Network automation is not going to give you better power or redundant circuits, or it's not going to prevent the backbone from hitting that one conduit that carries the load for you. What I mean when I say reliability is more along the lines of, let's imagine somebody has a thing you gave them from the network, right? Like somebody came to you and said, I need this feature in my office, and that's working for them. And they come to the same network services department and say, hey, Jeff across the hall needs that too. Ticket gets open, you do a thing, you close the ticket, and say, great, Jeff, you're good to go. Jeff is not good to go and has to open another ticket and say this isn't working. To Jeff, that is a reliability problem, right? And that's kind of where the human errors that Chris and Mark were talking about come in, right? When we do things manually, we kind of screw them up. So whenever you can find moments where your organization that provides the network has kind of screwed up how the network functions, and you can replace that with network automation to guarantee the same outcome every single time so that it works, that ties back to reliability. Bet you $5 right now, and each and one of you, that you can think of instances of that you've come across. Some of those are really important, right? Like, I don't know, grasping at air here. R&D went up to the boardroom to show something to the board, and they get bridged directly through on Wi-Fi because they have special stuff. They get carried back to the controller, and that VLAN isn't extended there, so some dude stood in front of the board, and his presentation didn't work. Like, that's an actual tangible problem, right? Where you can tell somebody, if I was operating my network differently, I would be able to not have these issues. Speed of execution. Once you have playbooks ready to go in your network, it takes a while to develop them, right? Like, this is not a trivial task. But once you have them ready to go, you can fix things significantly faster. So again, bet you $5, you can find somebody in your organization that complains bitterly about how much the network team sucks because every time they need a thing, right, they submit a ticket and it takes 2 days, and this is holding them up and they can't meet these KPIs because of whatever. Time of the CTO, I get a lot of those things. So, again, find those moments, right? And tell people, this is something I can address if you let me do things differently. Reporting is a really nice one. Also ties back to reliability in the sense of security. Cybersecurity is a pretty large issue for most organizations nowadays, right? Proliferation of ransomware, just in general, cyber insurance are kind of caught on to the fact that they don't want to pay out anymore, so that's not your cover-it-all protection anymore. So reporting and being able to tell the information security team what the blast radius is of something, because you have a comprehensive, complete model of what attaches where in the network, and you can directly tell them if this thing happened at this point in the network, this is what it could touch. That's really powerful. Hell, if you do a little bit better, right, you can record state over time, which means they can come to you and say, what was the blast radius 6 months ago when the intrusion first happened? And being able to actually give them an answer to that question is so powerful, that's actually not something they might ask you for, because they can't even conceive of the fact that that might be possible. That's how much they want this. So, the thing that disappoints most network engineers, and I came up as a network engineer, is that people genuinely do not care about the network that you're on. They don't, right? It's a thing to transport packets from A to B. It doesn't matter, they don't care what routing protocol you use, how much you're battling with each layer 2 domains. All of that is completely meaningless gobbledygook to the actual business owners. What matters is that they have business objectives they're trying to achieve, and the network is one way or one part of doing that. So find arguments that ties directly back to that. Usually when I talk about this stuff, I see about half the people going, yep, no, actually that's right. And the other half, I suspect they're going, yes, of course, I know that, that is obvious. I think there's a huge difference in intellectually understanding that that is true and actually arguing like that day to day. Like this whole agility, scale, resilience triangle is great. It is 100% true, and Mark couldn't be more correct if you choose on these axes. Nobody outside of the network cares, right? Tie it back to something that matters to your actual business, and that's how you get the resources to actually go on an automation campaign. And they're right about that. This is not the rest of the business being weak, particularly in brownfield, which is what this talk is aiming at, right? You have to figure out, if you want to go to automation, how to do two things at once now. Because you can't just say, I'm stopping operation for a full year or 2 years while I do this. You still have to do all the stuff you did before, right? You can't significantly scale back in delivering on what you're trying to deliver, and you have to do the new stuff on top of it. This either is going to cost a lot more money or FTE resources, or the business has to make compromises. So they're correct in that they shouldn't give you this just on a silver platter. Make a good business case. All right, so let's assume that now you've convinced people that you should be able, they should allow you to do this sort of project. In most organizations, the next question is simply like, how do I do that, right? Ideally, I thought I had 2 slides I was really proud of. The first one was an astronaut unicorn, where I talk about the fact, right, that ideally all the people that do all this NetDevOps for you are CCIEs with 20 years of experience. They all have been programming since the day of BASIC, and they all are great business analysts, right? Like, because that's 3 things you want to bring together for this thing. And of course, you don't have a team like that at all, right? Like, that's pretty rare. You might be able in Greenfield to hire a team like that, but it's really unlikely that your current network services are that. The next slide was the unicorn at a table, at a conference table, with a bunch of people with plungers on their head to look like narwhals, which you can't find except when a computer generates it for you. And that is probably what your team actually looks like, right? Like you might have 1 or 2 experts that are really good at this, but mostly what you have is a team that has some existing skills, hopefully some interest in this network automation thing, and you kind of going to have to make do with what you have. But in my experience, and working with a lot of peers, and talking to a lot of other folks, not just in higher ed as political, you can get really far with a team like that. Because when you're starting out with automation, so maybe take a small detour here. So there's really cool things you can do, right? I don't know if anybody's seen like Jeremy Schulman's talk at Manon, right, about instrumentation, making sure you define actual just services, right? Getting really close to intent-based stuff. That's great, but that's like going to Alpha Centauri, right? Like when you're starting out, you're trying to go to the moon, which is still a pretty big thing, right? We celebrated when NASA did that, right? I'm not trying to down-talk how easy it is to get to the moon, but the first thing most people try to go for is just config generation. And then the next step might be collecting a bunch of telemetry and data and comparing state from defined, like what should it be versus what is it, to get better alerts than just straight it down. And for config generation, really what you need is 3 things. It's just 3 things. You need some sort of model that defines what the network should look like at the lowest common denominator. Ideally, this is completely vendor neutral, right? Because the vendors have different attributes, yes, but they all implement the same standards. At the end of the day, an iOS versus a Junos template for configuring switchboards, like access layer user-facing switchboards, look very different, but the 2 things that are different is the interface name and the VLAN ID, your name, right? Like the rest of it is just kind of boilerplate around. So these models can be nice and abstract. So you need one of those. Then you need configuration templates in some sort of language, right? Like a Madlib thing where it says in the vendor language all the stuff and you fill in your variables, right? And last, you need to deliver that template to the device and apply it. So who knows how to apply stuff to a device? Well, your existing network engineers, right? Like it's not really that different to SSH into a box and paste something in and figure out how you can give a process a file and put it in. Like the more complex questions around that is, what's my jump box? Like, will my actions permit this? How does the management plan deal with this, right? Those sorts of things. And you have network engineers that presumably know how to do those things really well. Learning how to like stuff that into Normir with the help of a programmer, right, is actually pretty trivial. Building the templates is something network engineers are really good at. I mean, if you look at Ginger 2 or the templating language, right, like, what can you do with that? You can put in variables, you can print variables into the right slot, right? It's a print statement. That's literally the first, like, if you pick up learning Python the hard way, right, like page 1 teaches you how to print a variable. Sometimes you have lists of things, like all the interfaces, right? So you need a for loop, because you don't want to, repeat yourself too much. Well, for loops you can learn in pretty small amounts of time, I would say. And sometimes you have conditional blocks, right? I don't want to print the word disable on my Junos router unless the interface is supposed to be down. So I need if statements. And really, that's all Ginger 2 supports, right? Like, you can print variables, you can do for loops, and you can do if statements. So I'm not saying you can be an expert and master at this in like a day. Like, you can't do that. But you can pick up enough of this in a week that you can actually start being productive. If you have a network engineer that's been with you for 10 years that operates at like a CCNP or whatever level, they can learn this stuff really quickly and start being productive. The last thing is your data model. The data model is where most of the programming jobs are, right? Like that is actually, like it helps to know how to build a data structure that doesn't repeat itself, that is organized logically, that can be queried in an efficient way. Okay, so you need to hire a programmer. Because actually, if you look at this from the different perspective of, do you need to know any networking to do that part? I would argue the answer is probably no, right? Like, building that data model has got absolutely nothing to do with BGP or spanning tree or whatever. So if you pair a network engineer that knows the outcome that they want with such a programmer, they can just do that for you. And you can work together and achieve all these things. So I think a lot of teams that are currently not doing network automation because they think it's just too hard or they don't have the right team composition are really fooling themselves. This is a year-long process. These are smart people. Like, you trust them to run your production network. They, by definition, are pretty good at what they do, and they figured out some awfully complex things. Give it a try. Like, I think genuinely in most environments, this is a fairly successful approach. Kind of does lead directly to the question of, okay, so how do I do training for that, though, right? And I think one thing I've observed a lot of people do is make the mistake of figuring out a thing, a training product, and throwing that at it. Which is horrible, because you're asking people to do something really genuinely new to them. And people learn in very different ways. Some people respond really well to structured classes, right? Every day from 10 to 11, I do this thing. I have a live instructor maybe even that I can ask questions. And I sit down and I just work for a week, like a boot camp style thing, right? Like, I just do this thing. Other people don't do that well at all. They need asynchronous, where they have some sort of book or video delivery or whatever that they can do completely self-paced. I only do this when I have the right mental kind of state to do this. Or I want to do this in 30-minute blocks where I can just interrupt the whole thing and just think about it, go for a walk, really dig on those concepts, right, and then come back and do the next kind of little bit. So what you want to do, generally, I think, is just establish some sort of budget and let people go wild and hope. Now, that doesn't sound particularly business-oriented, but it does beat, I think, doing one thing. Because the worst thing you can do here is average. Because your average is going to be from whatever you pick. If you just pick one thing for people to do, it's going to be successful for some and a complete failure for others. Right? And that's kind of how you get that average value in the middle. And what you don't want anybody to feel like is left behind. Right? If you are asking network engineers to do this new thing, some of them might be kind of skeptical. And if you don't meet them kind of at their level of engagement for making sure that they have actual success stories early on, some of them are going to get really disillusioned and you stop having even internal buy-in. So you may need to iterate on this whole training thing a lot until everybody feels like they've gotten something out of it and are actually on board. At this point, I'm just going to bring up the slides here because I need a reminder of where I am and what I've done so far. I'm sorry. Thank you. One way to speed this up, right, is to get the right tools. Either buy them or open source, right? Like, don't feel like you need to invent anything at all from scratch, right? If you want to start with a network model, well, you know, NetDevOps is a pretty decent product for network modeling, right? Others are out there. If you just need something that kind of generates templates for you, right? Like if you're a Vista customer, right? ABB is pretty decent at that. So this is not necessarily a thing where you have to absolutely invent everything from scratch. You might get away with writing fewer than, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 lines of code, which overall is not that large of a code base to create, particularly when you're looking at this as a multi-year project. We'll talk about that a whole bunch more. The last thing I'll say is on team composition. You don't necessarily need to hire. This was a beautiful picture of a grain silo. So you probably have areas in your organization that have these skills, right? Like most of us work for companies that do have programmers. All right, maybe that guy wants to trade, right? Like they deploy apps all the time and run into firewall problems. All right, cool. How about the programmer comes over, helps us out for a little bit, right? Kind of is the mentor for our group. They probably have a scrum master or someone with a similar title, right? And in exchange, some of those network folks now start working with the application guys so that there's fewer network problems, or perceived network problems, because really we know all, right, like they did it wrong, sure, but that's not their fault, they didn't know any better. So let's go over and trade knowledge. So you can actually do this without additional money, right? As long as you get people interested the right way, they might actually help you out. It comes back to business problems. If that app team is having a ton of problems deploying things, they might actually be really, really interested in you doing network automation in the first place, because that can help them with that problem, and they might even be motivated enough to give you some of their resources and enable you to do that. Plus, all of the senior directors and everybody with the senior title is going to love that synergy of just teams, being cross-functional. All right, so I'll get to just some lessons that I have either learned myself or have learned vicariously from others, right, which is a better way to do it. The first one is that particularly as you're starting out, you're going to find you do stuff twice, at least, a lot. And that's fine. So these are new people learning new things. They kind of by definition don't know what they're doing, right? And we all know that whole known unknowns, unknown unknowns, right? So there's the known unknowns of, well, I don't know how to write this here, the two template. But there's also unknown unknowns, like maybe you're not aware that you can run out of TTYs on a router, right? They have a limited amount of logins you can do simultaneously, and depending on how exactly your automation framework shoots yourself in the foot by hammering those, right? It might not be closing them. You're walking up with a console cable to go and restart all of that stuff. So you are going to end up repeating work, simply because what you're building the first time around is not going to be perfect. But that is not a problem. Many people actually perceive that as a problem, but it's just a part of the process that's going to keep happening. You are replacing other parts of your IT infrastructure all the time, right? We're not running the same mail service anymore. We're not running the same web frameworks for generating our dynamic web pages anymore, right? I'm not saying they change every week, but everything in IT keeps getting reinvented over and over just as we learn how to do things better. And you kind of should accept that early on, you're going to make more mistakes, you're going to learn from them, and you're going to go back and do that again. That is something I think that the actual network engineers implementing stuff have to really come to terms with, because it can feel very disappointing when you realize you did something and it's you did that 4 months ago, you were really proud of it, you just learned a new thing, and now that thing isn't good enough anymore, and you're doing it again. So they should, culturally kind of come to terms with the fact that this is a reality. It's also really important for management to realize that and not punish teams or have expectations that are entirely unrealistic. One very short way of phrasing this is you're going to accumulate technical debt early on really, really quick. Technical debt is a huge problem for all of us in any shape of IT, but particularly early on these journeys, you have to make sure that you make enough time to clean that debt up. That leads into a nice little segue, I think, where there's a great talk out there, what is it, Pig Boring Tools or something? I don't know if anybody's seen that. Doing really, really innovative things that nobody else is doing takes a lot of cognitive load. If you're already asking people to operate their networks in a completely new and different way, at least give them the chance to Google things, right? If you're trying to do something that nobody else is doing right now, not only, like they literally have to figure it out from scratch. So in most cases, you're better off picking something that somebody else has already done and talked about and written blogs about and whatever, so that you can kind of learn from them and stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Like that old saying. So pick those wisely, and particularly if you're starting out now, there's a ton of things you can inherit from, right? Like there's genuinely this NetDevOps thing is taking off. So find somebody to talk to and get some guidance on how to best get started. And don't expect though, the main reason I think this is not yet a product you can just really buy and slam into anything without any work. Some organizations want to just buy a thing off the shelf. And network automation doesn't really fit that yet. I don't know that it ever will. Maybe once we get really mature it will. But it is something that is fairly custom because we all have different networks with different legacy apps, right? Like to Chris's point, we all got that, we literally at Dartmouth turned off the last 10 days T-Hubs a year ago. Horrible, right? Everybody's got legacy crap somewhere in their network, and some off-the-shelf thing is not going to address it. But you shouldn't let that hold you up, right? Just inherit as much as you can, pick the boring things, and then customize where you absolutely have to. This also kind of ties into, one of the sayings in DevOps, right, is this whole not pets, but cat, right? You're not supposed to treat your servers like pets, that you're careful and that you are very sad when they finally get, when they get exploited or when you need to shut them down or whatever. They're just cattle, they're completely anonymous, shoot them in the head, get a new house, right? So, I'm vegetarian. That did sound horrible, I'm sorry, that was too awful. So, this is also true though, kind of tying back to the point of doing it again. This is not just about your devices. So it would be easy to translate, right, server to switch or router in a sense. Where, yeah, sure, if you can do config generation, right, you can just swap out the template and you can change vendor. Like, great, that is actually one way in which comprehensive network automation makes it more like cattle. I don't actually care about the vendor anymore, which is terrible for vendors and good for consumers. But this should also apply to ideas and tools. Like, don't be afraid to throw your idea away and try something new. Don't be afraid to discontinue that tool, right, and pick something else that works better for you. Don't be afraid to rewrite your code, because you now know how to do that. So, kind of larger than that abstract concept. One really big point, kind of going back to the initial section on tie this to business outcomes. So you've been committed to introduce network automation in your organization, and you started, and you're doing stuff. You can generate the configuration for all your devices. What do you do first? Don't rip out ISIS and replace it with OSPF because it's the one you do for 10 years, right? Nobody cares. Again, nobody cares. So go start working on things that are actually visible and are delivering value to your clients or your organization or whatever. If you have, I'm not saying like violate the laws of causality, right? And like try to do impossible things. There are certain things you're gonna have to work on, kind of as building blocks for the rest of what you're trying to achieve. But when you have a choice between something that makes life easier for your network engineers and something that makes life easier for the service desk moving printers around, make the printer thing easier. Because now every time there's an IT technician out there moving a printer, he will sing the song of the heroic network team that made his day so much better. That's how you win, and that's how you get to do this. So choose wisely on what you put in your feature list. Is basically what I'm saying. It should not be a feature list that is purely optimized for efficiency on how you get to your desired end state. At Dartmouth, we took that pretty seriously. Justin back there can probably tell you stories about how much he gets annoyed with me sometimes when I say do this thing first. It took us about 4 years to pull this thing off for a campus with about 60,000 endpoints. And I think we could have done it in 2. Because of the way we did it, it took us. But I think we did it the right way, and we have complete and utter buy-in from the entire organization on how we're doing this, why we're doing this, and that we're going to continue to do this. And I think that was absolutely worth it. What does that mean by that? Oh, that's right. This is particularly for people who are managing teams like this, or who you're reporting to about how your team is performing on this. Time expectations change completely, and this is something that a lot of people walking into it kind of get disillusioned. It is, you know how usually, like, let's say you need to roll out a new feature on your routers, right? And you're doing this the old manual way of logging into each box and doing stuff. The first router is going to take you, what, a month? Like, you need to lab it up, right? In the lab, you need to figure out the configuration that you want to apply, you need to do all your testing, you need to figure out that it all works, you schedule your first maintenance windows, you do your first router. Then you can probably do 2 more in the next week or so, right? You're still careful, you're still checking the things, eventually you speed up to, I don't know, I'm making this up, you can do 2 a day. And then you just do 2 a day for a while. But you had your first result after a month, and then you kind of had, a speed up curve, and then you plateaued, and you just did it until you were done. With automation, the first one might take you 6 months, and then the next 1,000 takes you. Right? I mean, that's literally, it's just hockey stick. But that is really difficult for some people to get used to, because they want to see results. Whether you're doing this for the first time or introducing a new feature, whenever you're touching your automation, whenever you want to do something new on your network devices, you first have to go into the lab, still, right, and figure it out. Call back to, this is why network engineers can actually do this, not that much is actually changing. So you go to your lab, you figure all this out, you write your golden config. From there, you can take what you generated in the lab, take it out, that's your template. You remove all the things that are variables, right? You grab all the repeated stuff into your for loops. You put all the conditional stuff into your if statements, and now you have your template. Now you go back and you figure out what variables do I need to add to my, did it stop working? Test. Oh, no, go back. Now you figure out which variables you need to add to your network model in order to fill out your template, right? And then you're off to the races. But you can't do anything while you've changed your model, or just changed the template, or, whatever. Test. Okay, now we've got a thing. All right, so once you've done any of those steps, right, people in the network team can see progress, but nobody outside of the network team has seen that anything happen at all. Prepare people for that, right? Most of the problems we all get into, not just in work, but our relationships and whatever else, is mismanaged expectations, right? As long as you kind of set the right frame of mind in the party you're interacting with, they're probably going to be okay with what you're doing, or they can at least calmly argue back with you. So make sure that people are not expecting things to actually be delivered the same way as previously, to look the same way that it did before, right? Prepare kind of people for the fact that this is going to be a new thing. And then kind of near the end, I think one really cardinal mistake a lot of people make is you kind of hear these things like, we have a network automation project on the books. You don't, because the project is done, right? Like the project has an end date. At some point you achieve the thing and you move on to something else. That's not how any of this works, right? Like, Going to network automation means that you are changing how you're operating your network for now and forever. And whenever you want to add a new thing, you have to go back to the lab, you have to change your templates, you have to change your data volume, you have all these things, right? You no longer get to do one-offs. You no longer get to just simply sweep in as a hero, right? Swoop in as a hero and say, oh yeah, no, I know how to do that. SSH to a router, types 3 lines, and boom, the thing works and everybody's impressed. That's not how it works anymore. It'll just get overwritten during the next night you load. So you are never done with network automation. And that is actually something culturally that I think is really important. I sort of agree that culture is not a thing you just do, it's a byproduct, but you can steer it. And I think it's really important that you need to be upfront with people, particularly people in your team that might be slightly ambivalent about this whole thing, that this is not replacing them. We're not eliminating positions. We're not expecting you to just be programmers. They're not, right? Like if you talk to actual network engineers doing this sort of thing, network automation day in, day out, yes, there is some programming. Most of the time, that's not what they're doing. They're still doing network engineer things. But it is a change, and it will not stop. If you hate this, and we're doing this, get on board, or figure it out somehow, because this is not going to end in 6 months, or 2 years, or 3 years, right? This is now how we do things. All right, I think I covered most of that. I'm sure I left things out. And I've got a couple of minutes for Q&A if people have any comments or questions.
I have a mic for anybody with questions.
Okay, I'll help out.
Do you have any good stories or examples of using persuasion to change the minds of leadership on moving forward with more automation? Either in the ed tech context or commercial.
Yeah, mostly ed tech, but one really good example was, and actually this was at the state where we kind of been allowed to do it, so kind of for background. I started as a sysadmin a long time ago, changed to a network engineer, joined Dartmouth in 2011 as a network engineer. In 2018, I came up with a blueprint so we did a complete campus network replacement, every AP, every switch, every router, every phone, everything. And kind of in an architect role, I came up with an automation-centric approach to do this. Then our senior director decided to retire, and I had the choice of either trusting that whoever comes in will also buy into this, or doing it myself. Decided on that. Would not necessarily recommend going into management via that path, but it worked out for me. So we had kind of sold people on this, but not quite. COVID-19. We sent all our students home. We had horrible, horrible wireless in our dorms. Like genuinely barely good enough for streaming Netflix. And now the proposition was, hey, we're going to bring the students back so they have some sort of campus experience, but we can't hire them into classrooms, so they'll be Zoomed from the dorms. We knew that was going to fail. Like on the network that we had, that was going to fail. Using network automation, we deployed 2,100 APs in 2 days. By basically just standing up ZTP while we were waiting for delivery of hardware. And then we recruited about, 100 people or so from all over the college, made a YouTube video that shows how to mount those hospitality APs in rooms, and told them bring a screwdriver. Gave everybody in network services a team of like 6, 7 people that they ran through all the different dorms. We stood all that up. People absolutely loved it. And within 2 days, we had a functional dorm network. Would have been entirely impossible without network automation. And genuinely meant that we could have classes that dorm. Like, it doesn't really get much more of a business running than that. Anyone else?
Yeah, we got time for one.
Hello there. I was wondering, how do you create, quantifiable objective statistics or metrics in order to justify the cost of automation for upper level management or senior level management?
I don't. And sorry, I'm not trying to make a too sharp a point of it. That was the whole point of the first section where I'm saying, if you are a cost center, don't. What you're trying to sell is business outcomes. It might be more expensive to do it that way, but I can actually deliver on solving the problems that you have. If I'm trying to argue this from a cost perspective of this has saved, I don't know, $1 million compared to how we did things before, particularly in my vertical, I think that's a losing proposition to go from. Because the next thing people are going to say is, well, if you can save $1 million, you can save $2 million by eliminating some FTEs. I don't have any FTEs to shed. So basically, that's an argument on terms I don't want to have. And I've been fortunate enough that I don't have to. I'm sure others have an actual answer for you, but I've spent a lot of time deliberately not trying to have that argument.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Let's do a huge round of applause.